We said it was going to happen today, and it did happen today. Breaking news out of Portland. The Ninth Circuit, breaking news about Portland, I should say. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals has overturned Judge Immergut's order blocking the federalization of the National Guard, which means President Trump can. Am I right? Big deal?
It is a big deal, and I want to just correct one thing and then explain why functionally it is the same. This is a stay of Judge Immergut's opinion, and then just from a little bit of the beginning of this 93-page opinion, it says, after considering the record, and by the record they mean all the factual evidence at this preliminary stage,
This just happened. We have received confirmation of a historic rupture in the American political system. Late last night, in a move that insiders are calling a constitutional neutron bomb, the Supreme Court issued an emergency ruling that effectively dismantles the operating structure of the current administration. This is not a standard legal setback. This is a 7-2 decision that includes 3 justices appointed by the president himself, and it strikes down the core theory of power that the White House has been using to govern. The court has invalidated over 30 executive orders in a single stroke. They have blocked the federalization of the National Guard for domestic policing. They have stripped the president of the unilateral authority to control independent federal agencies. Sources inside the Capitol are describing the scene as absolute administrative paralysis. The legal framework that the president built to bypass Congress has been deleted from the books overnight. We are looking at the most significant check on executive authority in more than 50 years, and the language used by the Chief Justice suggests that the survival of the republic itself was the primary motivation behind this decision. This changes everything about how the government will function for the remainder of this term.
and this matter is tried and it gets back to an appellate court through an ordinary process where they have full briefing and full evidence, that they still think Donald Trump is likely to prevail there because he has the discretion to determine as the president.
We need to go through exactly what happened because the details of this ruling are absolutely seismic. The situation began with breaking news regarding the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which had overturned a lower court order blocking the federalization of the National Guard. For a brief moment, it looked like the administration had won a victory, allowing them to use state troops for federal purposes. But that victory was short-lived. The Supreme Court stepped in immediately with a ruling that went far beyond the specific issue of the National Guard. In a stunning 7-2 decision issued late at night, the Supreme Court struck down several of the president's most sweeping executive powers. The court explicitly called these moves unconstitutional expansions that violate the separation of powers. The opinion was unsigned, which often signals a unified voice from the court, and it invalidated the directives where the president granted himself unilateral control over independent agencies and state military units. The decision immediately froze dozens of White House orders. Insiders are describing the current situation as administrative paralysis across multiple federal departments. This is being called the biggest judicial check on a sitting president in over 5 decades. It is critical to note that this ruling came from a Supreme Court that includes 3 justices the president himself appointed. Let me break down the specifics of what the court actually blocked. The president has been issuing executive orders throughout his second term that massively expand presidential power. He claimed total authority over independent agencies that are legally supposed to be insulated from political control. He asserted the right to deploy state National Guard units for domestic law enforcement without the consent of the governors of those states. He also tried to give himself budgetary autonomy and control over federal hiring and firing that normally requires congressional approval. Essentially, the administration has been attempting to turn the presidency into an office with almost unlimited unilateral power. The Supreme Court just said no, and they said it in the strongest possible terms. According to reports from major news outlets like Reuters and NPR, the justices ruled that the delegation orders granting total authority over independent commissions and military deployments were unconstitutional. The phrase total authority was the actual language used in the executive orders. The president literally claimed total authority. The Supreme Court, in this 7-2 decision, clarified that this is not how the Constitution works. Presidents do not have total authority. They have limited powers defined by the Constitution and constrained by Congress and the courts. The emergency order specifically halts the use of state National Guard troops for domestic law enforcement operations. This has been a major flashpoint for months. The administration has been trying to federalize National Guard units from various states to use them for immigration enforcement, protest control, and other domestic operations. States like Oregon and Illinois have been fighting this in court, arguing that the president does not have the authority to commandeer their military forces against their will. Lower courts had blocked some of these deployments, but now the Supreme Court has shut down the entire framework the White House was using to assert this power. The opinions written by the justices are devastating for the administration. Justice Amy Coney Barrett, a crucial appointee of this president, wrote in her concurrence that no president may nullify Congress by decree. This is a justice who was put on the court specifically because the administration believed she would be loyal to conservative principles. She is now telling the president that he cannot just issue decrees that override congressional authority. This is huge because it shows that even justices who might be philosophically aligned with the president recognize that his actions have gone too far. Chief Justice Roberts went even further. He warned that unchecked authority strikes at the marrow of the republic itself. This is incredibly strong language from the Chief Justice. He is saying that these power grabs are not just legally questionable, but they are existentially threatening to American democracy. He is arguing that if these orders were allowed to stand, they would fundamentally alter the nature of our government from a system of checks and balances to something closer to an executive dictatorship. The practical impact of this ruling is immediate and severe. Officials inside the White House have told reporters that the ruling effectively suspends over 30 executive orders. This includes directives on immigration enforcement, budgetary autonomy, and federal layoffs. All of those orders are now invalid. Federal agencies are being forced to return to their previous structures immediately. This means policies that have been in effect for months are suddenly being unwound. Programs that were operating under the president's expanded authority have to stop. The entire administrative apparatus that was built to exercise unprecedented presidential power is being dismantled by judicial order. Legal experts are drawing parallels to the case of United States versus Nixon in 1974. That was the case that forced Nixon to release the Watergate tapes and ultimately led to his resignation. That was the Supreme Court telling a president that he is not above the law. This ruling is similar, but potentially even more sweeping, because it is not just about one specific controversy or one set of tapes. It is about the fundamental scope of presidential power. The court is saying the president has massively exceeded that scope. The 7-2 vote is significant because this was not a 5-4 decision along ideological lines. This was 7 justices, including conservatives and appointees of this very president, agreeing that he has gone too far. Only 2 justices dissented. When you lose 7-2 on questions of executive power, the court is sending a strong message that you have completely exceeded your authority. Aides inside the administration are privately acknowledging that this ruling has crippled much of their internal authority. They are calling it a constitutional ambush. That language reveals how unexpected this was for them. The team apparently thought they could keep pushing the boundaries of presidential power and the courts would let them. But the Supreme Court just drew a hard line. Now, the entire governance model, which was based on unilateral executive action without congressional approval or judicial oversight, has been declared unconstitutional. This is happening at the worst possible time for the administration. The president is already dealing with multiple scandals, including issues with trade investigations into the Department of Justice, perjury allegations against key staff, and various lawsuits. Now, the Supreme Court has taken away many of the tools he has been using to exercise power. He cannot use executive orders to do whatever he wants anymore. He actually has to work within constitutional constraints. This is going to severely limit what he can accomplish for the rest of his term. The White House officials are saying the ruling crippled their internal authority. Federal agencies that have been operating under expanded executive orders now have to figure out what they are supposed to be doing. The confusion is total. Are previous policies still in effect? Do they go back to how things were before the orders? Who has the authority to make decisions? The legal uncertainty is massive, and it affects some of the highest priorities of the administration. Immigration enforcement has been operating under expanded executive authority. Now, those operations might have to be scaled back or restructured. The mass federal layoffs the president ordered are affected. Federal agencies might not be able to fire employees the way the president wanted. Budget decisions that were made unilaterally might be invalid. The entire administrative apparatus is having to reassess what it is doing and whether it has legal authority to do it. Career employees who have been implementing these executive orders now do not know if they should continue. Legal offices and agencies are scrambling to figure out what is still valid and what is not. Programs are being put on hold pending legal guidance. The uncertainty is going to slow down government operations across the board. We need to stop and analyze why this specific event matters so much politically and institutionally. This is not just a legal loss, it is a complete refutation of a specific style of governing. To understand the gravity of this, we have to look at the theory the administration was using. They were operating under the idea of the unitary executive taken to an extreme. The belief was that the president, once elected, embodies the entire executive branch and therefore has total control over every moving part of the government, regardless of what Congress or existing laws say. The Supreme Court has historically given presidents a lot of leeway, especially on national security. But what happened here is that the court looked at the accumulation of power, control over the budget, control over the military domestically, and control over independent regulators, and realized it created a system where the other branches of government were irrelevant. When Chief Justice Roberts used the phrase marrow of the republic, he was identifying a systemic failure. If a president can rewrite the budget and deploy the military inside the country without oversight, the Constitution is effectively suspended. We should compare this to the most famous presidential check in history, the Nixon tapes case. In 1974, the issue was executive privilege. Nixon argued that the president had a right to keep his conversations private, even from a criminal investigation. The Supreme Court ruled unanimously that he did not. That ruling was about the president being subject to the law. The ruling we just saw is about the president being subject to the structure of the government. In many ways, this is broader than the Nixon ruling. The Nixon ruling stopped a cover-up. This ruling stops a method of governance. The fact that this was a 7-2 decision is the most critical political signal we have seen in years. In the current polarized environment, we usually expect the court to split 6-3 or 5-4. When you have three of the president's own appointees joining the liberal justices and the Chief Justice, it destroys the narrative that this is a partisan attack. It is an institutional defense. These justices realized that if they allowed the president to have total authority, the Supreme Court itself would become powerless. If the president can ignore the law, he can ignore the court. By striking this down, the conservative justices were protecting their own power and the relevance of the judicial branch. We also need to look at the specific issue of the National Guard. The Posse Comitatus Act is a federal law that generally prohibits the use of the military for civilian law enforcement. It exists to prevent America from becoming a police state where soldiers patrol the streets. The National Guard has a dual status, state and federal. By trying to seize control of state units against the wishes of governors, the president was attempting to erase the line between state power and federal military power. The court recognized that this was a dangerous precedent. If a president can take over a state's militia to enforce his political will against that state's governor, the concept of federalism is dead. This ruling also exposes the fragility of the administration's strategy. They relied entirely on executive orders because they did not want to or could not pass legislation through Congress. Executive orders are powerful, but they are fragile. They can be overturned by the next president or, as we just saw, struck down by the courts. By bypassing the legislative process, the administration built their entire agenda on a foundation of sand. The Supreme Court just kicked that sand away. The psychological impact on the political class in Washington cannot be overstated. For years, there has been a fear of the president's power, a belief that he could do anything and get away with it. This ruling breaks that spell. It shows that the institutions still have teeth. It shows that loyalty has limits. When Justice Barrett wrote that a president cannot nullify Congress, she was signaling to every other Republican official that it is safe to say no. This creates a permission structure for dissent. If the president's own hand-picked justice can rule against him on a fundamental issue, then a senator or a governor can certainly stand up to him. This erodes the fear factor that the administration has used to keep the party in line. It transforms the president from an unstoppable force into a constrained constitutional officer who is currently losing. We also have to analyze the concept of administrative paralysis. This is not just paperwork. This means that right now, thousands of federal agents and officers do not know what their orders are. It means that investigations, funding allocations, and hiring processes are frozen. The machinery of government relies on clear legal authority. When the Supreme Court says the authority you thought you had is illegal, the machine stops. This weakens the administration's ability to respond to any new crisis, whether it is economic, foreign, or domestic. They are now fighting a war on two fronts, trying to salvage their agenda in court and trying to figure out how to legally turn the lights back on in the agencies. Looking at the consequences, the short-term outlook is defined by chaos and legal warfare. The administration is going to be consumed by the effort to determine which parts of their agenda can be saved. White House lawyers will be working around the clock to redraft orders, but they are now working in a minefield. Every new order they issue will be immediately challenged in court, and lower court judges, emboldened by the Supreme Court's 7-2 signal, are going to be much more likely to block those orders. We are going to see a flood of lawsuits. We can also expect the opposition party to launch a massive offensive. Congressional investigations will likely open into the specific orders that were struck down. They will want to know who wrote them, who advised that they were legal, and if the administration ignored warnings from their own legal counsel. This ruling gives the opposition the ultimate weapon: validation. They can now say that their accusations of overreach were not political hyperbole but legal facts confirmed by a conservative Supreme Court. In the medium term, this severely damages the president's standing going into the midterm elections. The narrative of strength and total control is shattered. Voters will see a chaotic administration that cannot get its policies to stick. The administrative paralysis means that promises made to the base regarding immigration, the budget, or government downsizing will likely go unfulfilled because the legal mechanisms to achieve them have been broken. This makes the president look ineffective, which is often more damaging in politics than looking controversial. Long term, this ruling sets a precedent that will bind all future presidents. It establishes a hard ceiling on executive power. Future administrations, whether Democratic or Republican, will know that they cannot simply claim total authority over independent agencies. They will know that the National Guard cannot be treated as a personal domestic police force. This decision essentially recapitalizes the account of checks and balances. It ensures that the presidency remains a branch of government, not the government itself. We must also consider the possibility of a dangerous escalation. If the president decides to verbally attack the court or hint at defying the order, we enter a true constitutional crisis. However, given the 7-2 margin and the inclusion of his own appointees, he has very little political cover to do so. It is more likely that we will see a lame duck effect set in earlier than expected. With his executive tools stripped away and Congress likely hostile or deadlocked, the administration may spend the rest of its time simply trying to survive the investigations rather than governing. Ultimately, the consequence here is a restoration of friction. The system was designed to have friction to make it hard to do things without consensus. The administration tried to remove that friction to move fast and break things. The Supreme Court has put the friction back. The gears of government will grind slower now, but they will grind within the law. The experiment of the absolute executive has been terminated by the judicial branch.